I showed up from my business trip earlier than expected. I didn't tell my wife I was returning. I wanted to surprise her. When I arrived on our street, I saw several cars parked in front of our house. The garden was decorated with balloons. A banner read, "Happy Married Life." Then I saw my wife in a wedding gown and her boss in a suit walking out of my house kissing. You know how they say the best laid plans of mice and men often go to hell? Well, whoever they are clearly had a crystal ball pointed straight at my life. I'm Daniel, by the way, and if you're looking for a feel-good story about surprise homecomings and romantic reunions, you might want to grab the remote and switch to the Hallmark Channel. Because what I'm about to tell you is more like a train wreck in slow motion. Except the train is my marriage, and the wreck is happening on my own damn front lawn. 3 weeks. That's how long I've been stuck in Munich, dealing with the kind of business meetings that make watching paint dry seem like extreme sports. International contracts, time zone confusion, and enough bratwurst to feed a small army. But hey, the money was good, and Isabella had been understanding about my frequent trips. At least, that's what I thought. Turns out understanding was just another word I'd completely misunderstood, kind of like how I misunderstood "till death do us part" and forsaking all others. The flight back from Germany was brutal. 11 hours of airplane food that tasted like cardboard seasoned with disappointment, screaming babies, and some guy behind me who apparently thought the entire cabin needed to hear his life story. But I was pumped. I'd finished the deal 2 weeks early, which meant I could surprise Isabella. Picture it. Me walking through the front door like some romantic comedy hero, her face lighting up, maybe some of that movie magic where everything goes into slow motion and the music swells. Yeah, I was basically directing my own fairy tale in my head. I'd even practiced my entrance speech during the layover in Frankfurt. "Honey, I'm home early." Cheesy. Absolutely. Did I care? Not even a little bit. I was that guy. The guy who brings flowers to make up for missed dinners, who sends good morning texts from 3 time zones away, who actually believed that distance makes the heart grow fonder instead of making it grow wandering eyes. So there I was, driving down Maple Street in my trusty Honda. Not the flashiest ride, but it got me from point A to point B without requiring a second mortgage. I had my suitcase riding shotgun like a loyal companion, and I swear I was grinning like an idiot thinking about Isabella's face when she saw me. Maybe she'd cry those happy tears women do in movies. Maybe she'd jump into my arms and we'd spin around like we were auditioning for a Nicholas Sparks adaptation. Hell, maybe we'd finally use that expensive champagne we'd been saving for a special occasion. But as I turned the corner onto our street, my fairy tale fantasy took a hard left into Stephen King territory. Cars were everywhere. And I'm not talking about our neighbors' beat-up minivans and sedans. These were the kind of cars that cost more than most people's houses. Sleek BMW sedans, a couple of Mercedes that looked like they'd just rolled off the showroom floor, and a Tesla that probably had more computing power than NASA. My street looked like a luxury car dealership had exploded. At first, my brain did that thing where it tries to rationalize the impossible. Maybe there was a block party I'd forgotten about. Maybe someone was having a garage sale featuring only vehicles worth more than my annual salary. But then I saw the decorations, and my stomach dropped faster than a lead balloon in a gravity contest. Balloons. Everywhere. Pink and white balloons tied to every fence post, lamppost, and apparently every surface that would hold still long enough. They bobbed in the afternoon breeze like they were mocking me personally. And stretching across my front porch, was a banner that might as well have been written in my blood. Happy Married Life. Now, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I'm not completely dense either. My first thought was that maybe it was for the Hendersons next door. Old Jim had been dating that woman from his book club for months, and maybe they'd finally tied the knot. Yeah, that had to be it. The decorations were just really poorly positioned. The cars were probably for some other celebration entirely. And that banner? Just an unfortunate angle from where I was sitting. But then the front door of my house. My house, with my mortgage, my name on the deed, my stupid Daniel and Isabella Forever doormat, swung open like the grand finale of the world's cruelest magic show. And out walked my wife of 5 years, Isabella Marie Rodriguez Mitchell, looking absolutely stunning in a wedding dress that probably cost more than my car. Full white gown, train flowing behind her like she was floating on air, hair done up in one of those elaborate styles that takes 3 hours and a team of professionals. She looked beautiful, radiant, happy, everything a bride should look like on her wedding day. The only problem? She'd already had her wedding day. With me. 5 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago. I should know, I was there. Hell, I was the groom. But apparently, I wasn't the groom this time around. No, that honor belonged to Victor Ashworth, her boss, Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome himself, stepping out behind her in a black suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. Victor, I have a corner office and a trust fund, Ashworth, who'd always been just a little too friendly with my wife at company parties, just a little too interested in her ideas, just a little too quick to offer mentorship. And right there, on my doorstep, under a banner celebrating their happy married life, with balloons dancing in the wind like they were applauding, I watched my wife, cup Victor's face in her hands and kiss him like they were sealing a deal with their souls. Not a peck on the cheek, not some friendly celebration smooch. A full-on, Hollywood ending. I now pronounce you kiss that lasted long enough for me to count the ways my world was falling apart. 1. That was my wife. 2. That was my house. 3. That was supposed to be my life. 4. I was apparently the only person on the entire street who didn't get the memo about this little celebration. Mrs. Alvarez from across the street was standing on her front steps, hand pressed to her chest like she was watching the most dramatic telenovela of her life. And knowing Mrs. Alvarez, who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves, she probably had a front row seat to the entire backstory I was missing. She caught my eye and shook her head slowly, with that look that said, "Oh, honey, you have no idea what you just walked into." I sat there in my Honda, hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality, watching strangers celebrate in my yard while my wife kissed another man under a banner that was probably meant to celebrate their future together. The same future I thought I was building with her. The same house I'd been paying for while I was overseas, working my ass off to give us the life she said she wanted. My heart didn't break. That's too clean, too simple. Hearts breaking implies a quick snap, a moment of sharp pain, and then it's over. No, this was more like watching my heart get fed into a wood chipper, one piece at a time, while someone played cheerful music in the background. It cracked, splintered, and crumbled like old plaster, and with each beat, more pieces fell away until I wasn't sure there was anything left. The worst part? The absolute cherry on top of this disaster Sunday. They looked happy. Genuinely, radiantly, stupidly happy. Like they'd just discovered they'd won the lottery of love, and all it cost them was my entire existence. Isabella was glowing with that new bride energy, and Victor looked like he'd just conquered the world. Which, I guess, from his perspective, he had. He'd conquered my world, claimed my wife, decorated my house, and thrown himself a victory party. All while I was in Munich, eating terrible airplane food and practicing romantic speeches that were now about as useful as a chocolate teapot. I'd been planning a surprise, all right. I just hadn't realized I was the one who'd be surprised. Life's funny that way. Sometimes you're the person planning the party, and sometimes you're the poor bastard who shows up to find out the party's been thrown to celebrate your replacement. Welcome to my story. Try not to laugh too hard. You ever have one of those moments where your brain just straight up refuses to process what your eyes are showing it? Like when you're watching a horror movie and the protagonist opens the obviously haunted door and you're screaming at the screen, "Don't go in there, you absolute moron." Except this time, I was the moron, and instead of a haunted house, I was staring at my own front yard transformed into some twisted version of a wedding reception that I definitely didn't RSVP to. I pulled my Honda 2 houses down from the chaos, parking behind Mr. Peterson's ancient Buick like I was conducting some kind of suburban surveillance operation. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn off the engine, and for a hot minute, I just sat there like a deer caught in headlights, except the headlights were my own life imploding in high definition, surround sound, full Technicolor disaster. Part of me, the part that still had a functioning sense of denial, kept trying to rationalize what I'd just witnessed. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate practical joke. Maybe Isabella had been cast in a local theater production, and this was just a really committed dress rehearsal. Hell, maybe I'd finally snapped from all those international business trips and was having some sort of stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much airplane coffee and jet lag. But even as my brain scrambled for logical explanations, my gut knew the truth. And my gut was currently doing backflips while simultaneously trying to crawl out of my body and find somewhere safer to hide. This wasn't a joke, a play, or a psychotic break. This was my wife, in a wedding dress, kissing her boss, at what was apparently their wedding reception, happening in my house, on my dime, while I was supposed to be in another country for another week. From where I sat, I could see straight through the front windows into what used to be my living room. The furniture had been rearranged, probably to accommodate whatever Pinterest-perfect ceremony had taken place while I was eating pretzels at 30,000 feet. People were mingling around with champagne flutes. Laughing and chatting like this was the most normal thing in the world. Like cheating on your husband and throwing yourself a wedding party in his house was just another Tuesday afternoon activity. And the people, the people were the real kicker. I could see Isabella's parents, Martin and Helena Vasquez, holding court near what used to be my entertainment center. Martin was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, gesturing wildly with a champagne glass while Helena nodded along, both of them looking pleased as punch. These were the same people who'd welcomed me into their family 5 years ago, who'd called me Mijo and invited me to every holiday dinner. Helena had spent 3 hours teaching me how to make her famous tamales last Christmas, and Martin had given me his blessing when I asked for Isabella's hand in marriage. Now they were celebrating what appeared to be the dissolution of that very marriage they'd blessed, and they looked about as broken up about it as someone looks when they win the lottery. Helena kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, but it was the happy kind of tears, the my daughter found her true love kind, not the my son-in-law just got his heart ripped out and fed to him kind. But the real sucker punch, the one that made me question everything I thought I knew about loyalty and family, was seeing my cousin Leo standing near the kitchen doorway, red Solo cup in hand, grinning like he'd just witnessed the social event of the century. Leo, who I'd grown up with, who'd been my best man at my actual wedding, who'd helped me pick out Isabella's engagement ring, who'd sworn he'd always have my back no matter what. Leo, who was apparently totally cool with attending my wife's secret second wedding while I was out of the country earning the money that probably paid for the damn champagne he was drinking. The betrayal hit different when it came from blood. Friends can disappoint you, colleagues can screw you over, but family? Family is supposed to be the constant, the safe harbor, the people who call you up and say, hey, cousin, just a heads up, your wife's planning to marry her boss in your living room this weekend. Thought you should know. Instead, Leo was there, living it up like he'd scored an invitation to the party of the year. I could see him laughing at something someone said, probably some joke about poor, clueless Daniel working his ass off overseas while his wife planned her escape route. The sight of him made my stomach turn in a way that had nothing to do with airplane food and everything to do with the realization that apparently I'd been living in a bubble of my own making, trusting people who'd been playing a completely different game. I grabbed my suitcase from the passenger seat, because apparently I was glutton for punishment and still thought I might need it, and started walking toward the house like I was approaching the scene of a crime. Which, let's be honest, I basically was. The crime? Grand theft marriage, with a side of emotional homicide. With each step closer to my own front door, the conversations got clearer, the laughter got louder, and my sense of reality got more distorted. I could hear champagne glasses clinking, could smell what was probably some expensive catered food, could see the way people's faces were flushed with celebration and good times. Everyone was having a blast at Daniel's expense, literally and figuratively. The moment I stepped onto my own front porch, the porch I'd painted last spring while Isabella complained that the color was too boring, everything stopped. And I mean everything. The laughter cut off like someone had flipped a switch. Conversations died mid-sentence. Hell, I'm pretty sure someone's champagne glass froze halfway to their lips. It was like I'd walked into one of those old westerns where the piano stops playing when the gunslinger walks into the saloon. Except instead of a gunslinger, I was just a guy with a suitcase who'd made the grave mistake of coming home early to surprise his wife. All eyes turned to me, and let me tell you, there's nothing quite like being the center of attention at your own wife's wedding to another man. The expressions on their faces ran the full spectrum of human emotion: shock, guilt, embarrassment, and in a few cases, what looked suspiciously like pity. Mrs. Henderson from next door actually gasped and put her hand over her mouth. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh shit," under their breath. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of what used to be our living room, still in that gorgeous wedding dress, her veil now slightly askew like her whole perfect day had just been tilted off its axis. Victor was beside her, looking less like a triumphant groom and more like someone who'd just realized he'd forgotten to check the expiration date on his master plan. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, thick with the kind of tension you could cut with a knife. Everyone was waiting for me to do something. Scream, cry, throw punches, 'cause the kind of scene that would give the neighbors something to talk about for months. But instead, I just stood there in my own doorway, suitcase in hand like some traveling salesman who'd shown up to the wrong house, and asked the most reasonable question I could think of under the circumstances. What's going on here? For little words that carried the weight of 5 years of marriage, countless business trips, mortgage payments, shared dreams, and promises that apparently had expiration dates I hadn't been told about. For words that turned a celebration into a crime scene, that changed me from husband to intruder in my own home, that marked the exact moment when my old life officially ended and whatever came next officially began. The music had stopped. The glasses had stopped clinking. Even the damn balloons seemed to have stopped bobbing in the breeze. The world had stopped moving, and I was standing in the center of it all, waiting for someone to explain how the hell I'd become the villain in my own love story. You know what's funny about awkward silences? They have this weird ability to stretch time like taffy, making every second feel like an eternity while your brain scrambles to process information that makes about as much sense as a screen door on a submarine. I was standing there in my own doorway, suitcase in hand like some door-to-door salesman who'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood, while an entire room full of people stared at me like I'd just crashed their private party. Which, technically, I guess I had. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a butter knife, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see if I was going to explode like some kind of emotional hand grenade. But here's the thing about shock. It doesn't always look like what you'd expect. Sometimes it's not screaming and throwing things and making the kind of scene that ends up on social media. Sometimes it's just standing there, completely numb, while your world rearranges itself into something you don't recognize. Then Victor stepped forward, and I swear to God, this guy had the audacity to look annoyed. Not guilty, not embarrassed, not even remotely apologetic, annoyed. Like I was some unwanted interruption to his perfect day. He straightened his expensive tie, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and delivered what had to be the most casually devastating line I'd ever heard in my life. "You weren't supposed to be back." 5 words. That's all it took to confirm that this wasn't some misunderstanding, some elaborate surprise party gone wrong, or some stress-induced hallucination brought on by too many airplane peanuts. This was planned, calculated. They'd specifically chosen this week because they knew I'd be out of the country, buried in meetings and contracts, completely oblivious to the fact that my wife was planning her exit strategy in our living room. Victor said it like he was commenting on the weather, like my early return was nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his otherwise flawless execution. The sheer arrogance of it hit me like a slap to the face. This wasn't just betrayal. This was betrayal with a schedule, betrayal with a guest list, betrayal with catered hors d'oeuvres, and a goddamn photographer in the corner who was still holding his camera like he wasn't sure whether to document this moment or run for the hills. "You weren't supposed to be back." As if the problem wasn't that my wife had married another man in my house, but that I'd had the poor timing to show up for my own life's destruction. As if I'd violated some unspoken agreement by finishing my business trip early and coming home to the house I paid for, to the wife I'd been married to for 5 years, to the life I thought we were building together. Isabella finally found her voice, and when she spoke, it came out as barely more than a whisper, like she was trying to keep our conversation private in a room full of people who were all pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "Daniel, please, let me explain." "Explain." "Right. Because there's definitely a reasonable explanation for wearing a wedding dress and kissing your boss under a happy married life banner while your actual husband is in another country working to pay for the house you're getting married in. I'm sure there's a perfectly logical reason that would make this whole situation make sense. Like how she'd accidentally tripped and fallen mouth first on a Victor's lips while coincidentally wearing formal wedding attire. But here's the thing about explanations. Sometimes you don't need them. Sometimes the situation is so crystal clear that asking for an explanation is like asking someone to explain why water is wet or why the sky is blue. I could see the explanation right there in front of me. My wife in a wedding dress that cost more than most people's cars, a reception in full swing, guests who looked like they'd been having the time of their lives until I showed up to ruin the party. What exactly was there to explain? That she'd been lonely? That Victor had been there for her while I was working my ass off to provide the life she said she wanted? That she'd fallen out of love with me and into love with someone else? But instead of having the decency to tell me before I found out by walking into their wedding reception, she decided to handle it with all the grace and maturity of a reality TV show. Martin, my father-in-law, or former father-in-law, I guess, depending on how you looked at the legal implications of whatever the hell was happening, stepped forward with his hands raised like he was approaching a wild animal. "It's not what it looks like," he said, which had to be the most ridiculous thing anyone had said all day. And that's saying something considering Victor's opening line. Not what it looks like. Really? Because from where I was standing, it looked like my wife had thrown herself a wedding to marry her boss while I was out of town, using my house as the venue and apparently my extended family as guests. If that wasn't what it looked like, then I was seriously questioning my ability to process visual information. Helena, my mother-in-law, bustled over with that frantic energy that mothers get when they're trying to manage a crisis. She reached for my arm like she was going to lead me away from the scene, whispering urgently, "Don't cause a scene, Daniel. Please, let's talk about this privately." A scene. That's what she was worried about. Not that her daughter had just blown up her marriage in the most spectacular way possible. Not that her son-in-law had just walked into his own personal nightmare, but that I might cause a scene. Because apparently, the appropriate response to discovering your wife's secret wedding was to quietly excuse myself, maybe go wait in the kitchen while they finished up their celebration, and handle this whole mess with the kind of discretion that would preserve everyone else's comfort. Don't cause a scene. In my own house. At my wife's wedding to another man. While surrounded by people who had clearly known this was happening and had chosen to attend rather than, I don't know, give me a heads up that my life was about to implode. The audacity was breathtaking. The sheer, unmitigated gall of asking me not to cause a scene when they'd just caused the biggest scene in the history of my existence. They'd redecorated my house, invited dozens of people, hired what looked like professional catering, and thrown a full-scale wedding reception. But I was the one who needed to keep it down and avoid making a fuss. And Leo, God, Leo was the worst part of all of this. My cousin, my childhood partner in crime, the guy who'd been my best man and had sworn to always have my back, was standing there looking at his shoes like he could disappear if he avoided eye contact long enough. The shame was written all over his face. But he was still there, still at the party, still holding his red Solo cup like it was some kind of shield against the awkwardness of being caught celebrating his cousin's marital destruction. I could feel every pair of eyes in the room on me, waiting to see what I'd do next. Would I scream? Would I cry? Would I throw punches and give them the dramatic confrontation they were probably expecting? The photographer in the corner had actually raised his camera again, like he was hoping to capture the money shot of my breakdown for posterity. But instead of giving them the scene they were waiting for, instead of providing the entertainment they probably thought they deserved, I did something that surprised even me. I laughed. Just once, short and sharp, like a bark of disbelief. It came out sounding more broken than amused, but it was still a laugh, and it seemed to catch everyone off guard. "So this is my surprise?" I said, looking around the room at all the guilty faces, the abandoned champagne glasses, the wedding decorations that were still hanging cheerfully from my ceiling like nothing had changed. This is what I get for finishing early and wanting to come home to my wife. The silence that followed was even heavier than the first one, loaded with guilt and shame and the kind of tension that makes everyone wish they were anywhere else in the world. And in that moment, standing in my own living room surrounded by people who had collectively decided that my feelings were less important than their party, I realized that this wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of my naivety, my trust, and my belief that the people closest to you would never deliberately destroy your world while you weren't looking. You ever notice how in movies, when someone's world falls apart, they always have this dramatic moment where they storm out, slam doors, maybe throw something for good measure? Well, real life isn't quite that cinematic. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do is just walk away quietly. And let me tell you, that's exactly what I was planning to do. I was going to turn around, walk back to my Honda, and drive away from this nightmare with whatever dignity I had left intact. But apparently, Isabella had other plans. I'd barely made it 3 steps down my own front walkway when I heard the distinctive sound of expensive heels clicking rapidly on concrete behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. I'd been listening to that particular soundtrack for 5 years. But what I wasn't prepared for was the visual that came with it. My soon-to-be ex-wife running after me in full wedding regalia, her veil streaming behind her like some twisted version of a romantic comedy chase scene. Except this wasn't romantic, and it sure as hell wasn't comedy. This was tragedy with a capital T, playing out on Maple Street while half the neighborhood watched from behind their curtains like it was their own personal episode of Days of Our Lives. "Daniel, wait," she called out, and I could hear the desperation in her voice, could picture her trying to manage that ridiculous train while speed walking in heels that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. "Please, you have to let me explain." I stopped walking but didn't turn around. Not yet. I wasn't ready to see her face, wasn't ready to look at the woman I'd loved for 7 years, dated for 2, married for 5, while she stood there in another man's wedding dress, trying to convince me that this whole situation had some reasonable explanation. "Daniel, please," she said again, and this time she was close enough that I could smell her perfume. The same perfume I bought her for our last anniversary, the one she'd worn on our wedding day, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat when she walked past. Now it just made me feel sick. I finally turned around, and Jesus, she looked absolutely beautiful. That's the thing they don't tell you about heartbreak. Sometimes the person destroying your life looks like an angel while they're doing it. The wedding dress fit her perfectly, probably custom-made knowing Victor's taste for expensive things. Her makeup was flawless, her hair styled in an elaborate updo that must have taken hours. She looked like every bride's dream of perfection. She also looked guilty as hell. "I was lonely," she blurted out. Like that explained everything. Like those 2 words could somehow justify the nuclear bomb she'd just dropped on our marriage. "Daniel, you were gone too much. Victor was there for me when you weren't." And there it was. The explanation I'd supposedly needed to hear. I was gone too much. Working too hard, traveling too often, trying to build the financial security that she'd said she wanted, that we'd planned for, that was supposed to be our foundation for the future. I'd been busting my ass in Germany, dealing with clients who thought business dinners at midnight were totally reasonable, sleeping in hotel rooms that all looked the same, counting down the days until I could come home to her. Meanwhile, she'd been here, being lonely, and apparently the solution to that loneliness was to marry her boss in our living room while I was eating overpriced schnitzel and trying to close deals that would set us up for life. She reached out toward me, her hand extended like she was going to touch my arm. Like physical contact might somehow bridge the gap between "I was lonely" and "I married someone else." I took a step back. Not dramatically, not with any grand gesture, just a simple step backward that put space between us. But the way her face crumpled, you'd have thought I'd slapped her. So the solution was to marry him. I asked, and I was proud of how level my voice sounded, considering my insides felt like they'd been put in a blender. In my house. It was such a simple question. Really. Logic 101. If you're lonely because your husband travels for work, the reasonable solutions might include talking to your husband about it, suggesting he travel less, maybe seeing a marriage counselor, hell, even getting a divorce like a normal person. But throwing yourself a wedding party while your husband is out of the country? That's not a solution to loneliness. That's just straight-up betrayal with fancy decorations. Isabella's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to find words that didn't exist. What could she say? "Well, Daniel," I weighed my options and decided that adultery with a side of bigamy was the most mature way to handle my feelings. There was no explanation that would make this make sense, and we both knew it. That's when Victor decided to join our little sidewalk drama, because apparently, he couldn't let Isabella handle her own mess. He walked down the front steps with this casual confidence that made me want to punch something, preferably his perfectly symmetrical face. The guy looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for expensive cologne. Tall, dark, handsome, and completely lacking any sense of shame about the situation. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there next to Isabella like he was claiming his territory, like he was making sure everyone on the street knew who the new man of the house was. The silence was thick with testosterone and awkwardness, and I could practically feel the neighbors taking notes from their windows. Mrs. Alvarez was still on her front porch, no longer even pretending not to stare. She'd been living on our street for 15 years and had probably never seen anything this dramatic outside of her telenovelas. I caught her eye for a second, and she just shook her head slowly, like she was watching a tragedy unfold and couldn't look away. Old Mr. Peterson had come out to get his mail and was taking an unusually long time sorting through it, clearly eavesdropping on our conversation while pretending to be fascinated by what was probably nothing but bills and junk mail. Even the Martinez kids from 2 houses down had stopped their sidewalk chalk art to watch the show. The whole street was watching me fall apart in real time, and somehow that made it worse. This wasn't just private humiliation. This was public destruction, with an audience and everything. My marriage was ending on display, like some twisted performance art piece titled, "How to Destroy a Man's Life in 5 Easy Steps." Victor finally broke the silence, but not in the way you'd expect. He didn't apologize, didn't try to explain, didn't even acknowledge that what they'd done was monumentally fucked up. Instead, he looked at me with this expression of mild annoyance, like I was a problem he needed to solve rather than a human being whose life had just been destroyed. "This doesn't have to be difficult," he said, and I swear his tone was the same one you'd use to negotiate a business deal. "We can handle this like adults." Adults. Right. Because adults definitely handle relationship problems by throwing secret weddings while their spouse is overseas. Because mature people definitely resolve marital issues by redecorating someone else's house and inviting their families to celebrate the demise of a 5-year marriage. I looked at Isabella, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. The woman who used to laugh at my terrible jokes, who'd spend Sunday mornings in bed with me reading different sections of the newspaper, who'd cry during commercials about dogs finding their forever homes. But that woman felt like a stranger now, like someone I'd invented in my own head. "You've made your choice," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Now live with it." And with that, I turned around and walked back to my car, leaving them standing under their banner of lies, while the entire neighborhood watched me carry my suitcase and my broken heart away from the only home I'd ever really known. The sound of my suitcase wheels rolling across the sidewalk seemed to echo in the silence, like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd never wanted to write. Behind me, I could hear Isabella calling my name one more time, but I didn't turn around. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed with explanations or apologies or desperate pleas in wedding dresses. Some things just end, and all you can do is walk away with whatever dignity you have left and try to figure out how to build a life from the wreckage. You know what's funny about rock bottom? When you're falling toward it, you think you'll know when you hit. You think there'll be some kind of dramatic crash, maybe some spiritual awakening, definitely some kind of clarity about what comes next. What they don't tell you is that sometimes rock bottom is just a crappy motel room with water stains on the ceiling and a neon sign outside that buzzes like an angry wasp every 3 seconds. I couldn't go home. Hell, I didn't even know what home meant anymore. Was it still home if your wife had redecorated it for her wedding to another man? Was it still your sanctuary if strangers had been toasting champagne in your living room while celebrating the end of your marriage? So instead of driving back to Maple Street, I found myself pulling into the Sunset Motor Lodge on the edge of town, the kind of place that rents rooms by the hour and doesn't ask too many questions about why you're checking in with nothing but a suitcase and a shell-shocked expression. The guy behind the counter looked like he'd seen it all before, middle-aged men stumbling in at weird hours, looking like they'd been hit by emotional freight trains. He took my credit card without comment, handed me a key attached to a plastic keychain shaped like a cactus, and pointed down the hallway toward room 127 like he was directing me to my own personal purgatory. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a place called the Sunset Motor Lodge. Carpet that had seen better decades, a bed that sagged in the middle like it was tired of supporting broken dreams, and a TV that only got 3 channels, none of them worth watching. But it was quiet, it was private, and most importantly, it didn't have any wedding decorations or surprise husbands lurking around corners. I dropped my suitcase on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, and that's when it hit me. Not the anger, not the rage you'd expect. Those would come later. What hit me first was this overwhelming sense of exhaustion, like someone had pulled the plug on my entire existence, and all my energy was just draining away. I'd been running on adrenaline and shock for the past few hours, but now, sitting in this depressing little room with nothing but the buzz of that damn neon sign for company, everything caught up with me at once. I didn't cry. That's not how it worked for me. Instead, I just collapsed, like a building that's been holding itself up through sheer force of habit until someone finally removes the last supporting beam. I lay back on that questionable bedspread and stared at the water stains on the ceiling, trying to figure out how the hell my life had gone so completely off the rails. 5 years of marriage. 7 years total if you counted the dating period. I'd been with Isabella since I was 24 years old, through college graduation, first jobs, apartment hunting, house buying, career changes, family deaths, and every major life milestone you could think of. She wasn't just my wife. She was my best friend, my confidant, the person I called when something good happened, the first person I wanted to see when something went wrong. And apparently, she'd been planning her exit strategy while I was working my ass off to build us a future. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that was pretty spectacular. The worst part was realizing how blind I'd been, how completely clueless about what was happening in my own life. How many signs had I missed? How many times had Victor been just dropping by when I was traveling? How many late nights at the office were actually something else entirely? How long had I been the only person in my marriage who was actually trying to save it? I spent that entire night staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation, every text message, every seemingly innocent interaction between Isabella and Victor. The company Christmas party where they danced a little too close. The time she'd mentioned he was such a good listener when I was stressed about a particularly difficult client. The way she'd started dressing differently for work, buying clothes that were just a little more flattering, a little more expensive than her usual style. All the pieces were there. I'd just been too trusting, or too stupid, to put them together. When morning finally crawled through the thin curtains, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck, then backed over by the same truck for good measure. But I also felt something else, a grim kind of determination. I wasn't going to just roll over and let them destroy my life without consequences. If they wanted to play games with my marriage, my house, and my trust, then we were going to play by my rules from now on. The first call I made was to my colleague Tommy Rodriguez, no relation to Isabella's family, thank God. Tommy was one of those guys who always seemed to know someone who knew someone, the kind of person who could get you a good mechanic, a reliable contractor, or apparently, a shark of a divorce lawyer at 7 in the morning. Dude, what the hell happened to you? Tommy asked when he heard my voice. You sound like you've been gargling gravel. I gave him the abbreviated version. Came home early, found wife married to boss, currently hiding in motel room planning next move. To his credit, Tommy didn't waste time with shocked gasps or useless sympathy. He just said, Jesus, that's cold. You need Clara Mensa. She's a divorce attorney downtown, handles high-conflict cases. I'll text you her number. Clara Mensa turned out to be exactly what I needed. Smart, ruthless, and completely unfazed by my story. When I called her office at 8:30 sharp, she squeezed me in for an emergency consultation at 10. Her assistant warned me that Clara didn't usually take walk-ins, but when I explained the basics of my situation, she apparently made an exception. Clara's office was everything you'd want in a divorce attorney's workplace. Expensive furniture, law books that looked actually used rather than decorative, and an energy that suggested she'd seen every possible way humans could screw each other over and had developed strategies for all of them. Clara herself was a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun and the kind of steady gaze that made you feel like she could see straight through any bullshit you might be tempted to tell her. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad and occasionally raising an eyebrow at particularly egregious details. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and gave me the first honest assessment I'd heard in 24 hours. You've been screwed, she said bluntly. But legally speaking, you're in a better position than you might think. The house is in your name. Yeah, I bought it before we got married. Never added her to the deed. Joint bank accounts. Some savings, checking. But most of my assets are in accounts she doesn't have access to. Good. Smart. Whether you meant to be or not. Clara made more notes. Here's the thing, Daniel. Morally, emotionally, personally, yeah, you've been destroyed. But from a legal standpoint, they've handed you every weapon you need to fight back. She explained it to me in terms that made my accountant's brain happy. Isabella had no legal claim to my house, my business accounts, or most of my assets. The joint accounts could be frozen immediately. Victor, for all his swagger and expensive suits, had exactly zero legal standing in any of this. He was just the other man, with no more claim to my property than a random stranger on the street. You've been generous, Clara continued, looking through the financial records I'd brought. Maybe too generous. You've been funding a lifestyle she couldn't afford on her own salary. That ends now. Today, if you want it to. I wanted it to end. God, did I want it to end. I was tired of being the good guy, tired of being understanding, tired of being the responsible adult while everyone else played games with my life. If Isabella and Victor wanted to start their new life together, they could do it without my financial support. What do I need to do? I asked. Clara smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. We're going to freeze the joint accounts, secure your assets, and file papers that will make it very clear who owns what in this marriage. You've been supporting their little love story financially. Time to pull the plug on that funding. By noon, it was done. Joint accounts frozen, asset protection in place, and Isabella's access to what she probably thought of as our money officially terminated. Clara had moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this dance many times before, and she'd made it clear that this was just the opening move. They threw themselves a wedding party, Clara said as I prepared to leave her office. Now let's see how much they enjoy paying for the cleanup. For the first time since I'd walked into my own house and found my life in ruins, I felt something that wasn't pain or shock or betrayal. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't going to go down without a fight. Isabella had chosen Victor over me, chosen deception over honesty, chosen a fantasy over our reality. Now they were going to learn what it cost to make those choices. You ever notice how quickly people's attitudes change when the money train suddenly derails? Because let me tell you, watching someone's world crumble when they realize their sugar daddy situation has just been legally terminated is like watching a nature documentary about predators who suddenly discover they're actually prey. And Victor Ashworth was about to get a front row seat to that particular wildlife experience. Clara hadn't been kidding when she said she moved fast. By Wednesday morning, less than 24 hours after our meeting, legal papers were flying around like confetti at a parade nobody wanted to attend. The first bombshell landed on Victor's desk at Hartwell & Associates around 10 a.m., delivered by a courier who probably had no idea he was about to ruin someone's entire week. I wasn't there to see Victor's face when he opened that envelope, but Tommy filled me in on the details later. Apparently, the guy went from successful executive celebrating his new marriage to deer in headlights realizing hunting season just opened in about 30 seconds flat. The legal notice was crystal clear. Victor Ashworth had absolutely zero legal claim to any property, assets, or financial accounts belonging to Daniel Mitchell, and any attempt to access said property would result in criminal charges for trespassing and theft. Clara had a way with words that could make a parking ticket sound like a declaration of war, and this particular document was her masterpiece. It basically told Victor that his fairy tale weekend had just turned into a legal nightmare, complete with potential criminal charges if he tried to play house in my actual house. But the real beauty of Clara's strategy wasn't just the immediate legal smackdown. It was the timing. See, Victor had spent the weekend living it up like he'd just won the lottery, probably telling anyone who'd listen about his new wife and his new house and his new life. He'd been strutting around like a peacock who'd just discovered he owned the zoo, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire situation was built on quicksand and wishful thinking. Now he was finding out that not only did he not own anything, but he was also about to become legally homeless if he didn't vacate the premises immediately. And let me tell you, there's nothing quite like a reality check delivered via legal courier to really put a damper on your honeymoon phase. The second wave of chaos hit when Isabella tried to access our joint checking account to pay for what I can only assume were post-wedding expenses. Maybe she wanted to buy thank you cards for all the people who'd attended her bigamy celebration. Or maybe she needed to tip the photographer who documented her marriage to someone who wasn't her husband. Either way, She was in for a surprise that probably made her wedding day shock look like a gentle wake-up call. Frozen. Every account, every credit card, every financial resource she'd gotten used to having access to while I was overseas funding her lifestyle. Clara had locked down everything faster than you could say adultery has consequences, and Isabella was suddenly discovering what it felt like to be financially cut off from the gravy train she'd been riding for 5 years. The phone call started around noon. First Isabella, then her parents, then, and this was my personal favorite, Victor himself, calling my office like he had any right to demand an explanation for why his stolen life was being legally repossessed. Tommy intercepted the first few calls, playing secretary/bodyguard with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for people who really enjoy delivering bad news to people who deserve it. "Mr. Mitchell is unavailable," he'd say with barely contained glee. "But I'd be happy to refer you to his attorney if you have any legal questions." But Victor, apparently, was the kind of guy who didn't take hints well. He showed up at my office around 3 o'clock that afternoon, storming through the front doors like he was about to foreclose on the building. The receptionist, Sarah, called back to warn me that there was an extremely agitated man in an expensive suit demanding to see me. And honestly, that description could have applied to half the lawyers in the city, but I had a pretty good feeling I knew exactly which agitated man she was talking about. I could have hidden in my office, could have had security escort him out, could have handled the whole thing through lawyers like a civilized human being. But sometimes, you just need to look the person who destroyed your life in the eye and remind them that actions have consequences. So I walked out to the lobby, where Victor was pacing around like a caged animal who just realized the cage was locked from the outside. He looked different than he had at the wedding reception. Less triumphant, more desperate. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair was messed up from running his hands through it, and he had the kind of wild-eyed expression that suggested he'd been having a very, very bad day. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded the moment he saw me, his voice carrying across the lobby like he was addressing a board meeting instead of having a public meltdown in my workplace. I have to admit, there was something deeply satisfying about his obvious distress. This was the same guy who'd looked at me like I was an inconvenience when I'd walked into my own house, who'd delivered that casually devastating line about how I wasn't supposed to be back, who'd stood there smugly claiming my wife and my life like they were prizes he'd won in some twisted game show. "I'm protecting my assets," I said, keeping my voice calm and professional. "You know, the assets I earned while working overseas. The assets that have been supporting the lifestyle you've been enjoying. The assets that, legally speaking, have absolutely nothing to do with you." His face flushed red, and for a second, I thought he might actually swing at me right there in the lobby. But even Victor wasn't stupid enough to commit assault in front of witnesses and security cameras. Instead, he tried a different approach, the entitled rich boy routine that had probably gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice dropping to what I'm sure he thought was a reasonable tone. "Isabella and I are married. We have rights." Rights. That was rich. I couldn't help but smile at that one, which seemed to piss him off even more. "You're right," I said. "You do have rights. You have the right to find your own place to live, the right to pay your own bills, and the right to build your own life without using my money to do it. You can't just cut us off," he said, and there was something almost whiny in his voice now, like a kid whose allowance had just been revoked. "Isabella needs support. She's been dependent on your income." And there it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. Victor wasn't just Isabella's new husband. He was her financial plan. He'd married a woman who came with a house, a lifestyle, and a bank account. And now he was realizing that the package deal he'd thought he was getting had just been legally repossessed. "Isabella was dependent on my income," I corrected him. Past tense. That arrangement ended when she decided to marry someone else while still married to me. Funny how that works. Tommy appeared at my shoulder, probably sensing that this conversation was about to escalate beyond the level of workplace-appropriate drama. He crossed his arms and gave Victor the kind of look that suggested he'd be more than happy to personally escort him to the parking lot if necessary. "You should leave," Tommy said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that came from being 6'3" and not particularly fond of people who cheated on his friends. "Before this becomes a trespassing situation." Victor looked back and forth between us, probably trying to figure out if his charm and entitlement could somehow salvage this situation. But charm doesn't work when you're legally in the wrong, and entitlement doesn't pay the bills when you've just been cut off from someone else's money. "This isn't over," he said finally, which was exactly the kind of dramatic exit line you'd expect from someone whose life had just been legally demolished. "You're right," I replied as he headed toward the door. "It's not over. It's just getting started. And Victor," he paused and looked back, "you'll be around when the bills arrive." And with that, I walked back to my office, leaving him standing in the lobby with the dawning realization that his free ride had just come to a very expensive end. There's something poetic about justice, you know? Not the abstract, philosophical kind that people write essays about, but the real, tangible, consequences are coming to collect their debt kind of justice. The kind that shows up with official paperwork and doesn't give a damn about your feelings or your excuses or how expensive your wedding dress was. And after weeks of legal maneuvering, paperwork flying back and forth, and Clara working her magic behind the scenes, justice was about to make a house call to Maple Street. It had been 3 weeks since I'd walked out of my own wedding reception, or rather, Isabella's wedding reception that happened to be held in my house. And in that time, Clara had been busy dismantling their fairy tale piece by piece. Turns out, when you actually own something legally, and someone else is just playing house with your property, the law tends to side with the person whose name is on the deed. Funny how that works. I hadn't been back to the neighborhood since that nightmare Tuesday. Partly because I didn't want to see Isabella and Victor playing happy homeowners in my living room, and partly because Clara had advised me to stay away while the legal process played out. "Let them get comfortable," she'd said with that shark-like smile of hers. "The fall will be harder that way." But this morning was different. This morning, I had an official reason to be there, and more importantly, I had backup. The kind of backup that comes with badges and legal authority and absolutely zero patience for people who think they can ignore court orders. I parked down the street again, same spot I'd used that first day, except this time I wasn't carrying a suitcase full of hope and surprise. This time, I was carrying something much more valuable, the satisfaction of knowing that reality was about to come knocking, and it wasn't going to take, we didn't know, for an answer. The house looked different than it had 3 weeks ago. The wedding decorations were gone, obviously, but there were other changes too. Victor's Tesla was in the driveway like it belonged there, and there were new curtains in the living room windows, probably Isabella's attempt to make the place feel more like their home. Someone had planted new flowers in the front garden, and there was a fancy new mailbox that screamed, expensive taste funded by someone else's money. They'd really settled in, hadn't they? Made themselves at home in my home, rearranging furniture and redecorating like they were the rightful owners instead of a couple of opportunists who'd confused finders keepers with actual property law. Well, they were about to get a crash course in the difference. Officer Miguel Delgado was exactly the kind of cop you'd want handling your eviction. Calm, professional, and completely immune to sob stories or last-minute pleas for mercy. He'd been doing this for 15 years, Clara had told me, and he'd seen every excuse in the book. He wasn't there to negotiate or mediate or listen to explanations about how this was all a big misunderstanding. He was there to enforce a court order, period. "Mr. Mitchell," he nodded as I approached, "your attorney filled me in on the situation. I have to say, this is a new one, even for me." He gestured toward the house with the kind of casual authority that comes from years of dealing with people who think rules don't apply to them. Evicting someone from a house they never legally lived in because they married the legal owner's wife while he was out of town? That's definitely going in the Report Hall of Fame. The front yard was already showing signs of the chaos to come. Boxes were scattered across the lawn like the aftermath of a very expensive tornado, and I could see more being carried out by a couple of guys who looked like they'd been hired for moving duty. Isabella's clothes, Victor's electronics, wedding gifts that probably came from people who thought they were celebrating true love instead of witnessing a spectacular case of adultery with delusions of grandeur. Isabella was standing near the front steps, and she looked like she'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. The radiant bride from the wedding day had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd been living on stress and regret. She was clutching that same wedding dress. Apparently, she'd held onto it like some kind of security blanket, and watching her life get packed into cardboard boxes by strangers. Victor, on the other hand, Looked like a man who'd just discovered that karma not only exists but also has excellent timing and a law degree. He was arguing with Officer Delgado, gesturing wildly with the kind of entitled frustration that suggested he still didn't quite understand how he'd gone from living in a house to being legally evicted from it in less than a month. "This is ridiculous," Victor was saying, his voice carrying across the yard with the kind of indignation usually reserved for people who've never faced consequences for their actions. "I live here. We're married. This is our home." Officer Delgado had the patience of a saint and the authority of someone who'd heard this exact argument from deadbeat tenants, squatters, and now, apparently, homewreckers with delusions of property ownership. "Sir," he said in that calm, professional tone that cops use when they're explaining reality to people who don't want to hear it. "According to these court documents, this property belongs to Daniel Mitchell. You have no legal claim to this residence. But we're married," Victor repeated, like saying it louder would somehow change the laws of property ownership. "Isabella and I are legally married." That's when I decided to make my grand entrance. I'd been watching from a distance, but there's something to be said for timing your appearances for maximum dramatic impact. I walked up the front walkway, my front walkway, while Victor was mid-rant about his non-existent legal rights. He saw me coming and his face went through about 17 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Recognition, anger, embarrassment, and finally settling on that particular shade of red that people turn when they realize they're about to be publicly humiliated by their own stupidity. "You did this," he spat, pointing at me like I was personally responsible for the laws of property ownership and basic legal concepts. "You're destroying our lives." I couldn't help but smile at that one. It was such a perfectly Victor thing to say, accusing me of destroying the life he'd built by stealing mine. The audacity was almost impressive in a train wreck kind of way. "No, Victor," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. "You did this. I just own the house." Officer Delgado looked back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, probably trying to figure out if this was going to escalate into the kind of situation that required backup. But honestly, I wasn't interested in a fight. I was interested in watching Victor realize that all his swagger and entitlement couldn't change the basic fact that he'd been living in someone else's house without permission. Mrs. Alvarez had come out to watch the show, along with half the neighborhood. Word travels fast on Maple Street, and apparently, the eviction of the couple who'd thrown an illegal wedding reception was the kind of entertainment that brought out the whole community. She caught my eye and gave me a little nod that clearly said, "This is what we call poetic justice, Mijo." Isabella finally spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, please. Can't we work something out? This doesn't have to be like this. Work something out. Right. Because there's definitely a reasonable compromise between, you cheated on me and married someone else in my house, and let's all just get along." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I felt something that might have been pity. Not for the situation she was in, but for the person she'd become. "Isabella," I said, "you made your choice when you planned a wedding while I was working overseas to pay for this house. You made your choice when you invited your family and friends to celebrate your new marriage in my living room. You made your choice when you kissed Victor under that banner on my front porch." She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, but I wasn't done. "Now you get to live with those choices. Just not in my house." Officer Delgado cleared his throat, probably sensing that this conversation had reached its natural conclusion. "Ma'am, sir, you need to finish gathering your belongings. The court order is effective immediately." And with that, I turned around and walked back to my car, leaving them to finish packing up the life they'd tried to steal from me. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror, standing in the yard with their boxes and their regrets, while the for sale sign that would eventually replace their dreams got ready to take its place on the lawn. You know what they say about karma being a bitch? Well, let me tell you, karma doesn't just bite. It brings friends, throws a party, and sends out press releases. And over the next few weeks, I got to watch from the front row as the universe decided that Isabella and Victor's little love story needed some serious plot complications. It started with the whispers. Because in a city like ours, news travels faster than gossip at a high school reunion. And apparently, the story of the boss who married his employee while she was still married to someone else was the kind of scandalous office drama that people couldn't stop talking about. Victor had probably thought his workplace romance was going to be the stuff of corporate legend. You know, the successful executive who swept the beautiful married woman off her feet. Instead, it became the cautionary tale that HR departments use to explain why workplace relationships require disclosure forms. Tommy filled me in on the details over drinks at Murphy's Pub, because apparently, the business community in our city is smaller than you'd think, and everyone knows someone who works at Hartwell and Associates. Dude, Tommy said, shaking his head as he nursed his beer. Victor's basically become the office pariah. Nobody wants to work with a guy who's known for breaking up marriages. Bad for the company image, you know? Turns out, Hartwell and Associates was one of those old-school firms that prided themselves on family values and ethical business practices. Having one of their senior partners become famous for adultery and homewrecking wasn't exactly the kind of publicity they wanted associated with their brand. So Victor found himself being quietly shuffled to the sidelines, passed over for the big clients, excluded from the important meetings, and generally treated like someone with a contagious case of poor judgment. They didn't fire him, Tommy explained, but they might as well have. He went from being the golden boy to being the guy they hope will just quietly resign and save everyone the embarrassment of having to explain why they employ someone who thinks other people's marriages are a buffet. And Isabella? Well, Isabella was discovering that being known as the woman who married her boss while already married wasn't exactly the kind of reputation that opened doors in the professional world. Apparently, she'd been trying to find new work, probably because staying at Hartwell and Associates was becoming more awkward than a family dinner where everyone knows about the affair, but nobody wants to mention it. But in our city's tight-knit business community, her story had preceded her to every interview. The thing about professional reputations is that they're like expensive china, easy to break, expensive to replace, and once they're damaged, they're never quite the same. Isabella had gone from being a respected marketing professional to being a cautionary tale about workplace ethics and personal judgment. And companies, it turns out, are surprisingly reluctant to hire people whose personal lives read like a soap opera script. But the real entertainment started when the financial reality of their situation began to sink in. See, Victor might have had a good salary, but Isabella was used to a lifestyle that required two good salaries. She'd gotten comfortable with the kind of spending that comes from having a husband who works overseas contracts and brings home the kind of money that makes mortgage payments and designer handbags equally feasible. Now she was dealing with Victor's suddenly uncertain income while trying to explain to potential employers why her last job ended around the same time her marriage imploded in a very public way. And Victor, meanwhile, was discovering that supporting a wife who'd gotten used to a certain standard of living was a lot more expensive when you couldn't supplement it with someone else's bank account. The messages started arriving about 2 weeks after the eviction. Isabella, reaching out through text messages that started angry and gradually shifted to desperate. At first, they were all righteous indignation. How dare I cut her off financially? How dare I evict them from their home? How dare I destroy their happiness over a simple misunderstanding? Daniel, this is cruel and unnecessary, one of them read. We can work this out like adults if you just stop being vindictive. Vindictive, right? Because protecting your assets after discovering your wife married someone else while you were working overseas is definitely vindictive behavior. I showed the message to Clara, who read it with the kind of professional amusement that lawyers get when people fundamentally misunderstand how laws work. She's fishing, Clara said, handing my phone back. She's hoping you'll feel guilty and voluntarily give her what she can't get legally. Classic emotional manipulation disguised as reasonable negotiation. As the weeks went on, the messages shifted tone like a broken radio, trying to find the right frequency. Anger gave way to bargaining. Bargaining gave way to pleading, and pleading gave way to the kind of desperate messages that suggested Isabella was finally understanding the long-term consequences of her choices. Daniel, please. I made a mistake. I need you. Victor isn't. This isn't working out the way I thought it would. Can we talk? That message arrived on a Thursday night while I was sitting in my temporary apartment, a much nicer place than the Sunset Motel, with actual furniture and a view that didn't make me question my life choices. I read it twice, then set my phone down and went back to watching a documentary about penguins. Even penguins, it turns out, have more loyalty than my ex-wife. Clara had been very clear about the strategy, Silence. Don't respond to anything, she'd advised. Not the angry messages, not the pleading ones, not even the ones where she tries to make you feel guilty. Every response is evidence that she can still manipulate you, and every response gives her hope that she can change your mind. Silence is your most powerful weapon right now. So I stayed silent. I deleted the messages without responding, blocked her on social media, and generally treated Isabella Rodriguez Mitchell like someone who'd never existed in my life. It wasn't easy. 5 years of marriage doesn't just disappear because someone betrays you, but it was necessary. Some bridges need to be burned completely if you want to make sure you never accidentally walk back across them. The really satisfying part came when Leo finally worked up the courage to contact me. My cousin, my former best man, the guy who'd stood there grinning at Isabella's wedding reception like he was witnessing true love instead of epic betrayal, showed up at my office on a Tuesday afternoon looking like he'd been rehearsing an apology speech for weeks. "Daniel," he started, and I could tell from his voice that this was going to be one of those conversations where someone tries to explain away their terrible judgment with a combination of guilt and rationalization. "I need to apologize. I should have told you about Isabella and Victor. I should have called you, should have warned you, should have not attended their wedding reception," I interrupted, because honestly, I didn't have the patience for a long-winded explanation of why blood relations thought it was okay to celebrate the destruction of my marriage. Leo looked like I'd slapped him, which was probably the first honest expression I'd seen from him since this whole mess started. I thought maybe you knew. Maybe you'd agreed to some kind of arrangement. You thought it was normal for married women to throw wedding receptions for their new husbands while their actual husbands are overseas working? I asked. You thought that was a reasonable assumption to make. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then tried again. I was confused. The whole situation was confusing. Isabella said. I don't care what Isabella said. I told him. Isabella says a lot of things. What I care about is that when push came to shove, you chose to party instead of picking up a phone. The conversation went downhill from there, ending with me telling Leo that blood might be thicker than water, but loyalty was thicker than both, and he'd made his choice when he'd chosen champagne and celebration over family and truth. Don't come again, I said as he headed for the door, and I meant it. Some relationships don't survive betrayal, even family relationships. Especially family relationships, because family is supposed to be the safety net that catches you when everyone else lets you down. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. There's something liberating about cutting ties with people who've proven they can't be trusted, something freeing about realizing that you don't owe loyalty to people who've shown you none in return. Isabella could send all the desperate messages she wanted. Victor could struggle with his damaged reputation and financial reality. Leo could live with the guilt of choosing sides and picking the wrong one. Me? I was finally free to focus on building something new instead of trying to salvage something that had been broken beyond repair. There's something almost anticlimactic about the end of a marriage when it happens in a courtroom. You'd think that after all the drama, all the betrayal, all the secret weddings and eviction notices, the final act would be some kind of epic showdown. Instead, it's just paperwork, fluorescent lighting, and a judge who's probably seen this exact same story play out 100 times before, except usually without the bigamy subplot. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in Judge Patricia Henley's courtroom, and Clara had prepared me for what she called the most boring ending to the most dramatic case she'd handled all year. The papers speak for themselves, she'd told me the day before. We have documentation of everything, the house deed, the financial records, the evidence of her second marriage while still legally married to you. This isn't going to be a trial, Daniel. This is going to be a formality with a gavel. I'd been living in legal limbo for 2 months at this point, staying in a furnished apartment downtown while Clara worked her magic behind the scenes. It was a nice enough place, better than the Sunset Motel, anyway, but it felt temporary in a way that made everything else feel temporary too. Like I was existing in some kind of holding pattern while the legal system slowly ground through the process of officially ending what Isabella had already destroyed in practice. The courthouse was exactly what you'd expect. Marble floors, fluorescent lights, and the kind of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain all emotion from whatever drama was unfolding within its walls. I arrived 15 minutes early, because Clara had drilled into me the importance of being punctual professional, and prepared. Let them be the ones who look like they don't have their shit together, she'd said. Isabella and Victor showed up 5 minutes late, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Isabella was wearing a conservative black dress that screamed, "I'm trying to look respectable in front of a judge." And Victor was in what was probably his most serious suit. But there was something different about them, something in their body language that suggested the fairy tale had definitely lost some of its sparkle over the past couple of months. They weren't holding hands. That was the first thing I noticed. When they'd been playing house in my living room, when they'd been celebrating their love with my champagne and my mortgage payments, they'd been all over each other. Now they sat on opposite ends of the defendant's table like two people who'd been forced to share an elevator after an awkward breakup. Judge Henley was a woman in her 60s who looked like she'd been dealing with marital disasters since before Isabella was born. She had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she could cut through bullshit with surgical precision. And when she looked over the case file, her expression was the judicial equivalent of, "Oh, for crying out loud." "This is certainly an unusual case," she said, adjusting her reading glasses as she flipped through the documents. "Mrs. Mitchell," she paused, looked at Isabella, and corrected herself with what might have been the slightest hint of amusement. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you appear to have gotten married while still legally married to Mr. Mitchell. Is that correct?" Isabella's lawyer, a nervous-looking guy who probably wished he'd gone into tax law instead of family drama, stood up and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client was under emotional distress due to her husband's frequent absences for work. She made an error in judgment, but—" "An error in judgment," Judge Henley repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like Isabella had accidentally put salt in her coffee instead of sugar, rather than committing what was technically bigamy. "Mr. Ashworth, did you know that Mrs. Rodriguez was still married when you entered into this arrangement with her?" Victor stood up, and I could see him trying to channel that executive confidence that had probably gotten him through countless business meetings. But courtrooms aren't boardrooms, and judges aren't impressed by the same things that work on middle management. "Your Honor, I was led to believe that their marriage was essentially over," Victor said, and I had to give him credit for trying to sound reasonable while basically admitting that he'd knowingly participated in adultery. Mrs. Rodriguez indicated that she and Mr. Mitchell were separated and that divorce proceedings were imminent. "Imminent," the judge repeated, making a note on her paperwork, "but not actually filed or initiated in any legal capacity." "No, Your Honor." "I see. And you felt comfortable proceeding with a marriage ceremony based on this indication?" Victor's confidence was starting to crack like cheap paint in the sun. "We were in love, Your Honor. Sometimes love doesn't wait for paperwork." The courtroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop, and Judge Henley's expression suggested that she'd just heard one of the most ridiculous statements in her long career of listening to people explain their poor life choices. "Mr. Ashworth," she said finally, "love might not wait for paperwork, but marriage does. That's rather the point of having marriage laws in the first place." Clara was sitting next to me, and I could see her trying not to smile. This was going exactly the way she'd predicted. Victor and Isabella's lawyer were essentially arguing that feelings trumped legal reality, which was about as effective as bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. The actual divorce proceedings took about 20 minutes. Clara presented our documentation, the house deed in my name, the financial records showing that I'd been supporting Isabella's lifestyle, the evidence of her second marriage while still legally bound to me. It was all clean, straightforward, and legally bulletproof. Isabella's lawyer tried to argue for alimony, spousal support, some kind of financial settlement that would acknowledge her contributions to the marriage, but Judge Henley shut that down faster than a bouncer at closing time. "Counselor," she said, "your client ended this marriage when she married someone else. She forfeited any claim to spousal support when she committed bigamy. The law is quite clear on this matter." Victor tried to interrupt at that point, standing up like he was going to object to a business decision he didn't like. "Your Honor, with respect, Isabella's financial situation." "Mr. Ashworth," Judge Henley cut him off, "you are not a party to this divorce proceeding. Mrs. Rodriguez's financial situation became your responsibility when you married her, regardless of the legal complications of that marriage. If you're concerned about her finances, I suggest you address that in your own relationship." And that's when I realized that Victor and Isabella weren't just dealing with the end of our marriage. They were dealing with the collapse of whatever they'd thought they were building together. The stress of the legal proceedings, the financial pressure, the social consequences of their actions, it was all taking a toll on their fairy tale romance. When Judge Henley finally brought down the gavel and declared our marriage dissolved due to irreconcilable differences and adultery, Isabella looked at me across the courtroom with an expression that was equal parts regret and desperation. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," like those two words could somehow undo months of planning and betrayal and legal drama. I didn't respond. Clara had coached me on this too. No emotional outbursts, no dramatic statements, no giving Isabella anything she could use to claim that I was being vindictive or unreasonable. I just sat there, watched the judge make it official, and felt something that might have been relief wash over me like a tide. Outside the courthouse, Clara shook my hand with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a case that was never really in doubt. "You're free," she said, and it felt like breathing after drowning. "Legally, financially, and emotionally. The house is yours, the assets are yours, and Isabella Rodriguez is officially someone else's problem." As we walked down the courthouse steps, I caught a glimpse of Isabella and Victor having what looked like a very intense conversation near the parking garage. Their body language was all sharp gestures and defensive postures, the kind of argument that suggested their problems were just getting started. According to the gossip network that Tommy kept me plugged into, Isabella and Victor's relationship had been deteriorating for weeks. The financial pressure, the social ostracism, the reality of building a life without someone else's money to cushion the blow, it was all taking a toll on their grand romance. Word was that Isabella had been questioning whether Victor was really the Prince Charming she'd thought he was, and Victor had been questioning whether Isabella was worth the professional and personal damage he'd suffered. They'd wanted a fairy tale ending, but fairy tales are fiction for a reason. In real life, actions have consequences, betrayal has a price, and sometimes the people who destroy your world end up destroying each other in the process. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of the Sterling Heights, holding keys to apartment 12B like they were made of gold. Maya, the building manager, smiled as she handed them over. "Fresh start, Mr. Mitchell," she said, and damn if that didn't sound like the sweetest phrase in the English language. The apartment was mine, tall windows, hardwood floors, and silence that belonged to nobody but me. I furnished it myself, piece by piece, each choice mine alone. No compromises, no "what would Isabella think?" Just my taste, my comfort, my sanctuary. Rosa at Corner Cafe kept my usual table ready by the window. "Your coffee's getting cold," she'd joke when I was late. Tommy dragged me to football games, and slowly, I remembered what it felt like to laugh without checking over my shoulder. Sometimes I drove past Maple Street. The house sat empty, a for sale sign planted where Isabella's wedding banner once hung. The neighbors told Mrs. Alvarez that Isabella and Victor had split 2 months after the divorce. Apparently, love really doesn't conquer legal bills and damaged reputations. But I didn't carry their betrayal anymore. I carried freedom. The key in my pocket opened doors to my own life, my own choices, my own future. My name is Daniel, and this time, the story belongs to me.